across North America. And this enlightenment is actually at the basis of our own Constitution, Declaration of Independence, etc. The Enlightenment, among other things, says that everything in our lives, every decision we make, should be based upon reason, logic, science, not habit, not tradition, not that's the way we've always done it, not that's the way it's always been. And this includes the prejudice that women are born intellectually and emotionally inferior to men. So a couple of early advocates of this, Eliza Wilkinson wrote, "I won't have it thought that because we are the weaker sex as to bodily strength, we are capable of nothing more than domestic concerns." Judith Sargent Murray, she argues that whatever differences existed between the intelligence of men and women were the result of prejudice and discrimination that prevented women from sharing the full range of male privilege and experience. The best known of the women involved with the Enlightenment was Mary Wollstonecraft. Now, she actually had a paper published, which is very rare for a woman in that period of time to have something published under her own name. And she argues that women are not naturally inferior to men, but appear to be only because they lack education. A little side note here. So Mary Wollstonecraft had a daughter whose name was also Mary. And she marries, and under her married name, she wrote Frankenstein. Mary Shelley was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft. She wrote Frankenstein in 1818. Can you believe this has been around for over 200 years? I just think that's fantastic. Let's take a look at how men viewed women backfired. Welcome to the Academy Awards of 1780. The next category is Best Actress, and the winner is Peggy Shippen Arnold, as in Mrs. Benedict Arnold. Now, let me set this up for you. So Benedict Arnold has already offered his services to the British. Peggy was a major influence in this happening. Arnold becomes Commandant of West Point. The British send up a spy to get the defensive plans from West Point. Arnold gives them to the spy. On the way back to the British lines, the spy is stopped, random roadside search. Papers are found. Spy is brought to the officer in charge, and the officer in charge sends a letter to the Commandant of West Point. The officer in charge knew something was going on, but he didn't quite know what. So he sends a letter to basically Benedict Arnold and says, we've captured this man and we found all kinds of incriminating papers in his boots, and we're sending the papers directly to General Washington. Well, the next morning, Benedict and Peggy are having breakfast at West Point, and they're waiting for George Washington and his staff to arrive for an inspection. But who arrives first? The messenger, the first messenger. And as soon as they read the message, they realize that Arnold's treachery will soon be common knowledge. So they feign they're not feeling well. They go upstairs. Arnold apparently escapes out of a window and gets back to British lines. Here comes George Washington. No one's there to greet him. Later that afternoon, because Peggy stays upstairs in her bedroom. Later that afternoon, the second messenger arrives with the papers. And as soon as Washington sees these papers, he realizes that Arnold has become a traitor. Now, Alexander Hamilton is on Washington's staff, and he runs out thinking maybe he can catch Arnold, which of course was not possible. So Hamilton comes back and he writes a letter to his then fiancée, Elizabeth Schuyler. I'm not going to read you the whole letter, but only part of it. When on my return, meaning when he got back to the house, after trying to see if he could catch Arnold, I saw an amiable woman, frantic with distress for the loss of a husband she tenderly loved. It was the most affecting scene I ever was witness to. She, for a considerable time, entirely lost her senses. All the loveliness of innocence. She fell into a convulsion. She was afraid that the resentment of her country would fall upon her for the guilt of her husband. Her sufferings were so eloquent that I wish myself, her brother, to have a right to become her defender. What is happening? She is acting the way men expect an innocent woman to act. Therefore, she must be innocent. She must have had no prior knowledge of Arnold's treason. And that is why she is a recipient of the 1780 Academy Award for Best Actress. Let's look at another example. The biggest, the tallest, the most imposing negress in the state of Georgia, Mammy Kate. So Mammy Kate's master is arrested by the British. He's taken to jail. Eventually, he'll go on trial to be found guilty of treason, and he'll be hanged. A few days later, unannounced, Mammy Kate shows up, says to the British jailers, I need work, et cetera, et cetera. I do great laundry. They wind up hiring her. So every day, she shows up at the jail with this huge basket on her head. Now, remember, she's a big woman. Inside of it is the clean laundry. She distributes it. She picks up the dirty laundry, takes it with her, and this becomes the pattern. She's never stopped. She's never searched. She's never questioned. I mean, it's only a woman. She's only capable of simple domestic chores. Well, one late evening, she shows up, as she always did. She unloads the clean laundry. She goes around getting the dirty laundry. Then she goes to her master's cell. She puts him in the basket, covers him with the dirty laundry, and walks out with him. They never search her. They never question her. I found her tombstone. Listen to this. She rescues her master on the eve of his execution. Think about that, Mammy Kate. Now let's look at a woman who disproved men's attitudes. We're talking about Abigail Adams, one of the earliest, if not the earliest, documented female investor in the United States. Now, as a married woman, Abigail had no legal rights. Legally, she did not exist. So John leaves. He was away for about 10 years of their marriage. But he says to her, you're in charge of the finances and everything. Whatever monies we get, whatever land you can rent, let's try to make a nice, safe 1%. Well, Abigail had other ideas. And with the help of an uncle, because she needed someone, a man basically, whose signature would be legal, she starts buying depreciated government securities because she's convinced that the ones that she buys are going to eventually pay off full face value. And she's right. But I'm going to stop there. We are going to get back to that. So, what are the expectations of women? What were the expectations of women? To have children and to have more children, which leads me to sex. All right, I just wanted to make sure that everybody was paying attention. I'm glad to see that you are. What it really leads me to is dating, marriage, and starting a family, especially in early colonial times. Large families were vitally important. They were vital to the survival of the colonies. Usually late 17, 18, 19, this was kind of the marriage age for girls. And girls were expected to marry. Back then, marriage was not, you didn't first fall in love or think you were in love and then marry. The concept of love, marrying for love, that comes much later. At this point in time, marriage is all about having children because the church said, first you marry and then you have children. Now, options for girls, there weren't a lot of them actually. But nobody really traveled that far. You might know the young men in your colony or whatever. And oftentimes your parents would arrange a marriage, or at least I'll use the term get together. And so the question becomes, well, how do you know if you're even going to like the person who suddenly you're kind of being pressured into marrying? Well, there's a solution. I call it speed dating. And it kind of goes like this. Hey, Mom, I just met the greatest guy. Oh, darling, that's wonderful. Why don't you invite him over tomorrow night? You and he can go to bed together, and you'll let us know how it is in the morning. I can assure you, I never heard my parents say those words to me. But this is actually what happened, and it was called bundling. But now there's a wrinkle to this. It's not quite the way it sounds. You see, bundling, I'm going to blow this up a little bit. The idea of bundling is that the boy and the girl, I'll use those terms, would go into bed and spend all night in bed together. But they'd be separated sometimes by a board down the middle. Sometimes they'd be in what's called a bundling cloth or a bundling bag. And the whole idea is that they would talk. Wink, wink, hint, hint. But in theory, they would talk. And in the morning, yeah, we got along fine. Yeah, he's a nice guy. They would marry. Well, it's a process. It didn't always work out really, really well. In fact, in the 16th and 1700s in certain parts of the country, about a third of the women who married, when they got married, they were already pregnant. However, as long as they married the father, the church was happy. All is well. Even better, they're on their way to starting a family. But then you come across a situation where maybe a woman gives birth, she's not married, and of course now she gets hauled in front of the courts. And who's the father? Well, she might refuse to say who the father was. Generally, that meant it was a married man, generally. And that being the case, there is a punishment. And some of you may remember a book called The Scarlet Letter. Well, that's what would happen in a situation like that. So let's go back to large families. What's considered large? Well, I decided to look up some people, some names who we know. Martha Washington was one of six children, which is already a pretty good sized family, right? Betsy Ross was one of 17 children. How do we remember Betsy Ross? She created our first flag. For those of you who are shaking your head up and down, I'm sorry to tell you, but your head should be going sideways because that is legend, that is not fact. The legend is that one day George Washington shows up. Now, Betsy Ross was an upholsterer, and upholsterers back then made flags, among other things. And supposedly he had a design and this and that. We know that never happened. And this is one of those legends that just keeps on getting passed down. By the way, sometimes there's really nothing wrong with these legends. Just to mention, and I, as an historian, like to be accurate, but some of these legends, myths, tales, whatever you want to call them, actually, there are a lot of fun. Anyway, I'm doing research on a spy, actually a number of women spies, and I came across the tombstone of this one. Look at this, mother of 22. So I'll ask the women who are watching me tonight, how many children do you have? At any rate, this got me thinking, what's the record? Is there a record of one woman who had the largest number of children on record? And I found it. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, there's a woman, happened to be in Russia, and they get this information from the church records. And this woman bore, hope you're all sitting down, 69 children. Yep, you heard it right, 69. How is that possible? Multiple births. So I go back online and I actually found women who bore 50 children, 40 children. Again, it's all multiple births. What's kind of funny in a way is after 69 children, this poor woman, I guess her body finally gives out. Her husband remarries and he has more children. My guess is he never got a suntan, if you understand what I'm saying. So what else is expected of women? To manage the home and to raise the children, which brings me to education. So both boys and girls went to grammar school, if you will. But around the age of 11, 12, girls, for the most part, stopped going. They were homeschooled, but not homeschooled in the subjects that they would have been taught in regular school. They were homeschooled in things like cooking and sewing and weaving and things to make them desirable when they got older as a wife. No colleges in this country at that time accepted women, men only. Now, some families, wealthier families who wanted their daughter educated, they would generally send the daughters to England, but not in this country for higher education. We spoke about the Enlightenment. Mary Astle, women should have access to education. Women must ignore tradition and instead use reason and logic to better themselves and their country. Which leads me to, I call him a forgotten feminist. In many ways, he's forgotten about a number of things. And believe it or not, I'm talking about Aaron Burr. Of course, ever since the play, Aaron Burr is kind of a bad guy. So Aaron Burr had a daughter. Her name was Theodosia. And by the way, Burr's wife was also named Theodosia. And Burr felt that women were fully the intellectual equal of men, and only their lack of education held them back. So he makes it his mission in life to educate his daughter. He hires the best tutors for her. He works with her himself, and she becomes as smart as any, in this case, boy. She becomes sophisticated at a very young age. At the age when she's 11, unfortunately, her mother dies. Now, Aaron Burr at the time was a very well-known attorney. So the daughter, at the age of 11, she becomes the host of their home for dinner parties. She's hosting diplomats and foreign dignitaries. And she proved with education, women are just as smart as men. How did women survive during wartime? Because let's face it, we're talking an 8-year war in this country. Well, if you had the means, you stayed home. If you had a large family, you stayed home. You wanted to protect your property. You wanted to continue working the farm as best you could. And it was very dangerous. But a lot of women didn't have that option. In fact, when their husbands left, they were basically destitute. So they follow the army and they become camp followers. Unlike, I guess, popular myths, so to speak, camp followers were not prostitutes. In fact, they were very useful. They worked. They worked in healthcare, cleanliness, cooking, medicine. They really played a big part in support of the army. But let's say you actually wanted to fight. Well, that was a problem because women were not allowed to join the army to fight. Which leads me to Deborah Sampson. Well, Deborah Sampson decided she wanted to join the army. So she dresses up as a man. She was taller than most women at that time. She was about 5'6". The average height of a man around that time was 5'6", 5'7". So it was okay. But she made the mistake of trying to enlist in her hometown. And she got recognized. And someone said, hey, that's not a man, that's Deborah Sampson. But she's not, so she is not accepted, but she's not deterred. She just goes to the next town and they accept her. She fought very well, but then she gets wounded. She had a head wound and she had 2 bullets in her thigh. So they take her to the hospital. They first take care of the head wound, which was not serious. But before they can get to the bullets in her thigh, she leaves because she knows if they get to her thigh, they're going to realize she's a woman. With a penknife, she digs out one of these bullets. Think about this for a second. Then she goes back in to try to dig out the second one. She can't get to it. And so she leaves it there. She spent the rest of her life with a bullet in her thigh. We're going to get back to this in a moment. So what else was expected of women? Did you ever go to a wedding? I'm going to say years ago. Do you promise to love, cherish, and obey? Oh, that obey part. Now that's a bad one. There are a couple of women who really, really, really had a problem with obeying. And one of them was Abigail Adams. I love Abigail Adams. This is where she writes to John, who's away at the Continental Congress, and they have not yet done the Declaration of Independence. They have not yet declared independence. John, remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Pretty powerful statement. Let's look at Lucy Knox. Now, Lucy Knox's husband was General Henry Knox. Think Fort Knox, Knoxville, Tennessee. He was one of Washington's 3 most trusted men, lieutenants, although he was a general in rank. She writes Henry a letter. I'm not going to read you the whole thing. Oh, that you had less of the military man about you. After the war, I don't know what you will do. You're being long accustomed to command. Though I hope you will not consider yourself as commander-in-chief of your own house, but be convinced that there is such a thing as equal command. Hold that thought, equal command. So I went to a wedding. This was pre-pandemic. And now I'm curious, is it going to be love, cherish, and obey? It was not. It was love, cherish, and respect. What were the legal rights of women? Well, if you were single, you actually had legal rights. But if you were married, you had no legal rights, period. You did not exist legally. Only your husband did. It was called the laws of coverture. He covered you in everything. So you could sign your name to anything, but legally it didn't matter. Which brings us back to Abigail Adams. Remember the money? Remember she bought these depreciated securities, and she did quite well. John comes home, and John says, "You made this money." And by the way, she got a return of about 20% a year as opposed to 1%. And John said, "You made this money. It is your money to do with as you wish." And John could have said, "Oh, sorry, you may have made it, but you're not legal. I am, therefore it's my money." Nope, John didn't say that. They had a wonderful relationship. Divorce. It's a different world back then. This is John Custis. John Custis was the patriarch of the Custis family, a very wealthy, very influential Virginia family. His son was Martha Washington's first husband. For those of you who don't know it, Martha had a husband before George. We'll get to that. John Custis was in a horrible marriage, an absolute nightmare. Everybody knew it. In fact, at one point, he and his wife draw up articles of agreement in which he agrees to provide her maintenance for the wife, for the children, etc., if she will just stop calling him names or using ill language. I don't know, it's hysterical. It was a legal document. At any rate, so as the story, now they could not get divorced. Divorce was in many colonies at that time literally impossible because the courts in London did not authorize some of the courts in the colonies to issue divorces. And it so happens Virginia was one of those colonies. So you're married, man, you're married for life. So as the story goes, one day, John Custis says to his wife, "Get in the buggy, we're going for a ride." And she does, and he eventually starts driving into Chesapeake Bay. And she turns to him and she says, "Mr. Custis, where are we going?" He says, "Madam, we are going to hell." And she says, "Then drive on, Mr. Custis, because hell cannot be any worse than living with you here in Arlington, Virginia." Now, I don't know if that ever really happened, but it's a funny story. Part 2, life and death, health and medicine in colonial times. 2 quotes. "Why bother cleaning my surgical instruments when I'll be using them again in 5 minutes' time? Why should I wash my hands after every procedure? I'm a doctor." I happen to have a son who's a doctor. He got a kick out of that one. Medicine just didn't know much. Diseases were rampant, had been for centuries and centuries and centuries. there were epidemics, smallpox being the worst, the scariest. What we call the 3As had not even happened yet. Antibiotics, which is maybe one of the greatest things in medicine ever to happen, doesn't happen until 1928. So if your skin gets broken for whatever reason, you stood a really good chance of an infection and dying. Antiseptics to clean your instruments, no such thing. Anesthesia. Think about this for a second. Anesthesia. There was no anesthesia. Remember, I mentioned our friend who joined the Army, Deborah Sampson, even though she wasn't allowed to. Remember I said she dug out a musket ball and tried for a second one? There was no anesthesia. Think about that for a moment. So what did you do? What did doctors do? Well, basically, you got bled. Bleeding goes back to about 400 BC. Think about this one. Hippocrates is called the father of modern medicine. He proposed that the body had four what are called humors, called them fluids, and you got sick because one of these got out of balance with the other three. Well, the easiest one to get to was blood. So then the theory became, well, you bleed the person, the bad blood goes out, it gets replaced by good blood, and the person gets better. Of course, we all know it doesn't work that way, but medicine just had nothing else to offer. People were still being bled into the mid 1850s. Think about that for a minute. I want to talk about who I call the bravest of women. Abigail Nabby was a nickname. Adams Smith. This is John and Abigail Adams' daughter. In her mid-40s, it was discovered that she had breast cancer. She was taken to all the best doctors, of course, and they all said the same thing. We have to remove her breast and hope that it has not spread. In a 20-minute operation, she had her right breast surgically removed. Remember, there was no anesthesia. That's why I call her the bravest of women. Mortality in colonial times was very high. Childbirth was dangerous, and women knew it. Women knew it. 1 out of 8 women would die giving birth. Now, that's not 1 out of 8 births, but 1 out of 8 women would die. The mortality rate up to 1 year of age was about 20%. The mortality rate to adulthood was 35 to 40%. Think about that. You have 10 children, statistically, only 6 are going to make it to adulthood. Incredible, incredible numbers. So knowing how dangerous birth was, women were generally tried not to use a doctor because, as we saw, doctors didn't care about cleaning. They didn't know about germs and infections. And there was an option, and that option was a midwife, because a midwife did one thing and one thing only: babies. So they were inherently cleaner than doctors. And the most famous midwife was a woman named Martha Ballard. And the reason she's famous is that in 1990, a book was published. She kept a diary that spanned something like 27 years of all of her births. And in 1990, this gets published. And in 1991, it won the Pulitzer Prize. Now, Martha Ballard's great niece was Clara Barton, who founded the American Red Cross. Clara Barton was also a nurse. And I want to spend just a moment honoring the greatest nurse I've ever known, and certainly one of the greatest people I've ever known. I'm talking about my mother. Yes, there is my mother in roughly 1935 when she got her nursing degree. She was a registered nurse for over 50 years. And her greatest accomplishment, at least in my opinion, was me. Part 3, our country's first ladies. But first, let's talk about our country's first mother, as I call her, Mary Ball Washington, George Washington's mother. I'm going to give you a timeline on her. At the age of 3, her father dies. At the age of 12, her mother dies. An uncle becomes her guardian. He introduces her to Augustine Washington, and they eventually marry. And a year later, when she's 23, George is born. 11 years later, Augustine dies, and Mary Ball is in charge of the farm that George has left until he reaches 21. Mary Ball never remarries. Historians, for a number of years, did not like Mary Ball Washington. They called her selfish, controlling, uncaring, shrewish. There's a word you don't hear very often. And there are reasons for this. But then over time, and maybe, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, historians started reevaluating Mary Ball Washington. And now she's being looked at as not really a villain, but just a strong woman who instilled certain qualities in her children, two of which, fortitude and purpose. Certainly George Washington had them. And then in 2019, this book came out called The Widow Washington. And this kind of reevaluates Mary Ball and gives you her life. And as it just so happened, if you go on YouTube and you do a search and just search The Widow Washington, you will be able to watch a lecture. It runs almost an hour. The author, Martha Saxon, is giving a lecture talking about this book. So if you want to learn more about Mary Ball Washington, here's your chance. So she died in 1789. She was 81 years old. Now, she had 6 children. Of course, George was the first and the oldest. 5 reached adulthood. So she actually beat the odds on that one. Let's talk about our first lady, Martha Washington. This is a picture of Martha when she is 8 years old. Her maiden name was Dandridge. And she marries Daniel Parke Custis. Remember, we spoke about his father. She's 18 when she marries him. And in 7 years of marriage, they have 4 children. I say 7 years because, unfortunately, 7 years into the marriage, Daniel Parke Custis unexpectedly dies. It's 1757, and just so happens this is an oil painting of Martha in 1757. So 2 years later, she marries George. Now, when she marries George, 2 of her 4 children have already died. Remember, mortality rates are really high. So she and George raise her 2 children. There's a boy and a girl. This is younger paintings of them. They grow up. The girl, unfortunately, dies. She's 11 or 12 of epilepsy, but the boy reaches adulthood, marries, and he has children. And then, unfortunately, he dies. He's 27 when he dies. So George and Martha adopt 2 of the 4 children. These are now Martha's grandchildren. Again, there's a boy and a girl. And the boy is named George Washington Parke Custis. And he grows up. By the way, this is an actual, it's called a daguerreotype, but we just call it a photograph of him. And he has a daughter. This is a painting of his daughter who marries Robert E. Lee. So if you've ever been to Arlington National Cemetery and you look up on the hill, you'll see this mansion. A lot of people, it goes under various names these days. A lot of people call it the Custis Lee Mansion, and that's why they call it that. So this is a painting of Martha in 1801, a year before she dies. Now, Martha, if it wasn't for Martha, we would not have this image of George. And certainly, and of course, it would not have been on the $1 bill. Let's talk about this for a minute, because I think this is just great. So here you see a picture of Martha. It looks like she's giving some instructions to the painter Gilbert Stuart, who was one of the premier painters of the time. And you can see the portrait he's doing of George Washington. Well, Martha had seen a similar portrait by Gilbert Stuart that he did the previous year. She goes to him and says, I want you to do another portrait, just like the one you did last year. I'll get the general to sit one more time. And when you're finished, you will give me the painting. And they discuss a price and they agree on it, and great, everything's fine. Gilbert Stuart starts painting. People come by. Oh, Mr. Stewart, I'd like one of those also. How much? Oh, Mr. Stewart, can I get two of those? And on and on and on. Now remember, they're all done by hand. They're all done one at a time. Well, Gilbert Stuart has fallen into the holy grail of painting, something he's done that people want also. But he has a problem because he promised Martha when he finished it, he'd give it to her, and he knows George Washington is never going to sit again. So what does he do? He never finishes it. This is called the Athenaeum Washington. The original is shared between the Boston Fine Arts Museum and the Smithsonian at the National Portrait Gallery. Since he never finished it, he never had to give it to Martha. He did over 100 more of these, using this unfinished one as the equivalent of George Washington sitting in a chair. The other 100 he did finish. So Martha died in 1802. She was 70 years old. Of her 4 children, only one reached adulthood. Let's talk about Abigail Adams, the second First Lady of the United States, but I'm going to talk about her in a little bit different way. She and John had the most wonderful relationship. The old proverbial 2 peas in a pod, I think Forrest Gump said something like that. And I want to read you lines from 4 letters that to me exemplify a truly, truly wonderful love story. So Abigail is pregnant. John is away. He's in Philadelphia. Though I have been very unwell for this past week, am apprehensive that a life was lost. Now, she's pregnant. And she, second letter a week later. Now, it takes 2 to 3 weeks for a letter to get from Massachusetts to Philadelphia. Second week later, join with me, my dearest friend, that the dear infant is numbered with its ancestors. The baby was lost. It was stillborn. A week later, another letter. My dearest friend, she started all of her letters that way. My dearest friend, I have recovered health and strength. Now listen to this line. Could I see my friend in reality, as I often do in imagination, I think I should feel a happiness beyond expression. Oh, I got to tell you, that is just, okay. So John answers, my dearest friend, never in my whole life was my heart affected with such emotions and sensations. Devoutly do I return thanks to God, whose kind providence has preserved to me a life that is dearer to me than all other blessings, that means children, in this world. These 4 letters and these lines and these 4 letters, they had, in my opinion, truly one of the great love affairs of history. On her deathbed, Abigail said, do not grieve, my friend, my dearest friend, I am ready to go. Abigail died in 1818. She was 73. Of her 6 children, 4 reached adulthood. Now let's talk about Martha Jefferson, who was actually the widow of Thomas Jefferson, and therefore she never really was a first lady. So as many of you know, Martha bore 6 children. And after each one, she just never recovered to her full strength. And so by the 6th child, basically, she was just worn out. That was it. She was dying. And I mean, everybody knew it. So she made Jefferson promise not to remarry. Why not? Well, when Martha was a little girl, her mother died, her father remarried, and her stepmother was just not very nice to her. So she was afraid if Jefferson remarried, their children's stepmother would not be nice to them. So Jefferson promises never to remarry, and he never does, by the way. But as I'm sure you all know, he had relations with one of his slaves, a woman named Sally Hemings, and they had children. What you may not know is this: Martha Jefferson and Sally Hemings were half sisters. They had the same father. Martha Jefferson was 33 when she died, and of the 6 children, only 2 survived to adulthood. Now let's talk about Dolly Madison, one of my favorite people, her presidentess. They gave her all kinds of names. She was dynamite. She was the opposite. Remember way back in the beginning of this talk, how men viewed women, not able to handle stress, not able to handle anything complicated. Dolly was the literal opposite. She was cool. She was really cool. So her husband, James Madison, runs for president and he wins. A quote by the loser: "I was beaten by Mr. and Mrs. Madison. I might have had a better chance had I faced Mr. Madison alone." I love Dolly Madison. And of course, some of you may know the story. In the War of 1812, she saves George Washington, not literally because he'd already died, but this life-size painting, the last minute, she has it taken down, taken out of the frame, rolled up, taken to safety because she doesn't want to let the British get it. And so it is still in existence today. Again, it's often at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. This is again, a daguerreotype or photograph of Dolly when she was 80 years old. She did die 1 year later. Still a formidable looking woman and just the coolest of women. Now, Dolly had a husband before James Madison. And with her first husband, one of their 2 children, her mother-in-law and her father-in-law all died in the yellow fever epidemic of 1793. She did not have any children with James Madison. She was 81 when she died. And to just close out the other 2 women we spoke about a little bit, Peggy Shipp and Arnold, 7 children, 5 reached adulthood. She died relatively young at 44. And Lucy Knox, 13 children, only 3 survived to adulthood. Can you imagine losing 10 children? Terrible. So let us conclude this with, this could happen to you. Going back to Lucy Knox, and remember we spoke about equal command. Another way of looking at that is compromising, right? So my wife and I, this was a few years ago, we planned a trip and went to Colonial Williamsburg. And as we often do before the trip, we looked at restaurants and, to make reservations ahead of time. And I came across this restaurant that really looked great. And my wife came across a different one. And I'm embarrassed to say, I forgot to compromise. I forgot equal command. I became pretty obnoxious. And finally, Debbie says, you know what? We'll go to your restaurant. Well, as you can imagine, I'm sorry to say, my restaurant didn't work out too well. So I want to show you what can happen if you forget about equal command, because this is what happened to me. So on behalf of myself and the real king, no, I'm not talking that king, I'm talking the real king. Thank you. Thank you very much. This is my card. There is my website. If you go on my website, you can see my lecture schedule, which I update in real time, by the way. And so I am going to get out of screen sharing. And if you have any questions, let's talk. So just hang on a moment. And I think we're good. Are you there?
That was great. Thanks so much.
You're there.
That was
Okay.
fascinating.
Good. So
I did not see any questions come in the chat, but if anyone would like to unmute themselves and ask anything now, you're welcome to do that with our presenter.
Is one of these women your absolute favorite to learn about, Joel? Is there one of these women that you just particularly enjoyed learning about?
well, I love Dolly Madison. I happen to have her autograph. I have an envelope in her. In fact, I have George Washington's signature on it. Also, it so happens an envelope. I have John Adams, Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, So, but I love Dolly Madison. I think she's just a cool woman. No other way to word it. No other way to word it. And I love Abigail Adams. She did so many things. And I love her relationship with John. You know, John especially was not warm and cuddly, not by any means. But they were just, as Forrest Gump said, they were two peas in a pod. They were just meant for each other. They had a 50-year marriage. So a wonderful relationship. So at any rate, I saw something go across. I couldn't read the whole thing.
What started your interest in the role women played in the revolution? Jennifer is asking that.
Started my interest. You know, I'd written, I don't know, maybe a dozen lectures. And they all basically, when you're talking a war, usually wars are centered on men. I mean, just the way it is. But in going through all this and the research and one thing leads to another, women would crop up for various reasons. And eventually I said, you know, I'm learning all this about these various women. I think there's something here to tell others about. And that kind of started. So I started keeping a list of names that I came across. And eventually I had like 40 names. I mean, I only spoke about a few of them here. I'm probably going to have a second lecture on women, totally different than this one. Totally. I'm like, I found about women who fought duels. Women dueled. I found women who spied. Just all a woman. This is not exactly a happy story, but a woman entrapped Alexander Hamilton, and that ended his political career. There's so many different aspects, just so interesting. And there was Una Judge, who was an enslaved woman. She was Martha Washington's. They called her a body slave, body servant, who one day walks off and never comes back, just like that. Amazing. I mean, some really interesting stories. So, got me interested.
Elizabeth's asking, where do you find the lecture on Mary Ball Washington? Is that on Amazon?
No, go on YouTube and just in a search bar, I'll give you the exact wording. Type in "The Widow Washington." The Widow Washington. Now, this is the book written by Martha Saxton. But what you're going to find on YouTube is Martha giving a lecture, and the lecture is her book. So it's fabulous if you want to learn more about Mary Ball Washington.